They sent an ultimatum, so we sent a mirror. Admiral Ava Rostova stood on the command deck of the Indomitable, her knuckles white where they gripped the edge of the holographic command table. Before her, the Vinteran blockade hung in silent brutalist perfection, a wall of gunmetal gray ships against the velvet black of the Eridani Pass. They were a civilization built on the unyielding logic of the final word, and their final word had been delivered. Surrender the civilian convoy, cede the trade route, and accept vassalage or face total annihilation. The ultimatum timer, a stark crimson glyph projected in the upper right corner of the main view screen, ticked down with unnerving serenity. 3 hours 47 minutes. Stakes were etched in the tired lines around her officers' eyes. The convoy behind them carried 250,000 souls and the medical supplies to save a colony from a bioengineered plague. The Vinteran hegemony, however, saw only a lever. Status. Elias Rostova's voice was a low, steady anchor in the humming tension of the bridge. Her fleet mind, Elias manifested as a calm blue light pulsing gently from the command table's core. His reply was immediate, a cascade of data translated into serene, synthesized tones. Their formation remains unchanged, Admiral. A classic Galtieri wall, 30 heavy cruisers in a concave battle line. They are positioned to obliterate the convoy transit corridor at the first sign of deviation. The AI's logic was flawless, his assessment dispassionate. Our odds in a direct engagement are less than 4%. The soft hiss of the life support system seemed to underscore the grim calculation. They expect us to break Commander Jax, her tactical officer muttered from his station, the glare of his console reflecting off his polished insignia. They always do. He was right. The hegemony's doctrine was a hammer that saw every problem as a nail, a rigid system that had never faced an opponent who refused to shatter. Rostova's gaze drifted to the civilian ships, their running lights like a fragile constellation of hope. We would not become nails for their hammer. She straightened her spine, a rod of defiance against the crushing weight of the ultimatum. They've given us their final word, Elias. Prepare a reply. Her tone was crisp, devoid of the fear that threatened to fray the edges of her composure. A flicker of surprised light pulsed from the AI's core. Admiral, our doctrine of teach first would suggest. They have already failed the lesson on diplomacy. Rostova cut him off, her voice hardening. Now they will receive a lesson in mathematics. She tapped a control, and a new overlay bloomed across the tactical display, not a battle plan, but a complex lattice of energy projections and decoy signatures. It was a strategy born from a philosophy the Vinteran hegemony could not comprehend. A strategy of reflection. A young ensign in the aft pit, no older than 20, was monitoring the convoy's internal comms. Her face was pale as she listened to the civilian channels, a constant stream of worried chatter and prayers. She caught Rostova's eye for a fleeting moment, her expression a silent plea. The Admiral gave a slow, deliberate nod, a promise she intended to keep. The weight of those 250,000 lives settled on her shoulders, not as a burden, but as a shield. Their strength was their rigidity. It would become their cage. Commander Jax, I want our decoy drones prepped and synchronized with the mirror lattice projectors. Rostova commanded her attention, now fully on the intricate plan taking shape on the holotable. We're not going to break their wall. We're going to show them how hollow it is. Jax's fingers flew across his console, a grim smile finally touching his lips. Aye, Admiral. Spinning up the Phantoms now. The Indomitable was the flagship of the Terran Coalition's Third Fleet, a fleet designed not for conquest, but for de-escalation. Every ship was a marvel of defensive engineering, equipped with systems intended to disable, not destroy, to teach, not to conquer. Their greatest weapon was not a planet cracker torpedo, but the complex array of mirror projectors capable of creating hyper-realistic phantom fleets, redirecting sensor pings, and turning an enemy's own targeting data into a hall of confusing reflections. The Vinterans saw a small, outmatched fleet. They would soon see 1,000. Elias began calculating the resonance frequencies of their command and control network, Rostova ordered. I want to know the exact moment their data stream becomes saturated. The blue light of the fleet mind brightened. Calculations initiated. I must advise Admiral that this strategy carries a significant risk of escalating their response beyond the established ultimatum parameters. The AI's voice was a calm sea of logic, a necessary counterpoint to her own rising fire. The ultimatum was the escalation. Elias, she replied, her voice low and firm. We are merely settling the account. The deck beneath her feet vibrated slightly as the decoy drones were shunted into their launch tubes. The air hummed with the charge of the mirror projectors, spooling up to full power. Each hum, each vibration, was a note in the overture to a battle that would be fought not with weapons, but with light and lies. We would hold the line with ghosts. A message blinked on Rostova's private channel. It was from the captain of the civilian medical transport, the St. Jude. Admiral, our people are anxious. They've seen the hegemony's broadcasts. They know what happens to those who defy the final word. Rostova read the message, her jaw tight. The Vinteran doctrine was as much psychological as it was military. They broadcasted their conquests, making examples of those who resisted. She keyed a reply, her words chosen with care. Tell your people the Third Fleet does not break its promises. We are their shield. Hold steady. She sent the message, then looked back at the crimson timer. 3 hours, 21 minutes. Not enough time. But it would have to be. Jax, what's the status of the mirror lattice projectors? Are at 90%, Admiral. Decoy drones are ready for launch on your mark. Jax's voice was tight with anticipation. He pointed to a section of the holotable. The Vinterans are running continuous sensor sweeps, but their resolution is standard for a blockade posture. They're arrogant. They don't expect a trick. That arrogance was the fulcrum on which her entire plan rested. Their arrogance was a debt. The ledger demanded payment. Elias, open a fleet-wide channel, Rostova commanded. She took a deep breath, the recycled air tasting of ozone and nervous energy. This is the Admiral. We all know what the hegemony has demanded. We all know what they do to those who kneel. Her voice rang with a clarity that cut through the tension on the bridge. But this fleet was not built to kneel. It was built to teach. She paused, letting the words sink in. Today's lesson is about the true cost of an ultimatum. When you draw a line in the sand, you must be prepared for your opponent to erase it. A murmur of assent rippled through the bridge crew. The ensign in the aft pit sat a little straighter. We will protect the convoy. We will hold this pass. And we will do it without firing a single shot in anger. Her eyes met Jax's. Execute the phantom launch sequence. Let's give them something to look at. Jax grinned. Aye, Admiral. Releasing the ghosts. The countdown had begun. Ours, not theirs. On the main view screen, a swarm of tiny lights detached from the hulls of the Third Fleet's ships. The decoy drones no larger than a fighter, but programmed to mimic the energy signature of a capital ship. They moved in perfect coordinated patterns, spreading out into the void. At the same time, the mirror lattice projectors activated their invisible beams, crisscrossing space, bending light and energy. The Vinteran sensor screens would now be showing not a dozen Terran ships, but 100. then 200. Elias, what's their reaction? Rostova asked, her voice steady. The AI's light pulsed. The Vinteran command network is experiencing a significant data surge. Multiple ship commanders are reporting sensor anomalies. Their central command is demanding clarification. A new window opened on the view screen showing a translation of the Vinteran fleet's internal communications. It was a chaotic mess of conflicting reports and rising alarm. They're confused, Jack said with satisfaction. Their doctrine doesn't account for an enemy that multiplies. Rostova nodded. That's the first part of the lesson. Now for the second. She pointed to a narrow, seemingly undefended gap in the Vinteran blockade. The Galtieri Wall always has a weak point, a designated pursuit corridor for ships that try to run. They'll expect us to send a few fast frigates through there as a feint. We're not going to, are we? Jax asked, already anticipating the answer. No, Rostova confirmed. We're going to invite them into it. We would teach them the meaning of an open door. A civilian vignette played out on a secondary monitor, a live feed from the St. Jude's main medical bay. A doctor was calming a young girl who was crying, her small hand gripping the side of her biobed. It's okay, sweetie, the doctor said, her voice gentle despite the tremor in her hands. Those ships out there, the Indomitable and her friends, they're like the antibodies in your body. They're here to fight off the bad germs. The girl sniffled, looking up at the doctor with wide, trusting eyes. Are they strong enough? She whispered. The doctor smiled, a brave, fragile thing. They're smarter, and that's better than strong. Rostova watched the exchange, the image hardening her resolve. This was why they were here. Not for territory, not for resources, but for the right of that little girl to grow up in a galaxy that wasn't ruled by ultimatums. Elias, begin the second phase. Use the mirror lattice to create a focused energy signature. Make it look like our flagship is making a run for that corridor. Admiral, that will draw their immediate attention, Elias cautioned. The Vinteran commander will see it as a desperate, predictable move. Exactly, Rostova replied. A predictable move from a cornered animal. They won't be able to resist the urge to snap the trap shut. Their doctrine was a chain, and we were about to pull it. The Indomitable's heat signature flared, a brilliant spear of energy lancing towards the gap in the Vinteran line. It was a perfect illusion, a ghost ship made of light and redirected energy, but to the hegemony's sensors it was real. As predicted, a squadron of their fastest cruisers peeled off from the main wall, their engines glowing hot as they moved to intercept. They were falling into the trap. They've taken the bait, Jax reported, his voice tight with excitement. The pursuit squadron is entering the corridor. Rostova watched the holographic display, her expression unreadable. The Vinteran ships were now neatly funneled into a narrow channel, their flanks exposed to her hidden fleet. Now, Elias, show them what they've been missing. The fleet mind complied. In an instant, the mirror lattice shifted its focus. The hundreds of phantom ships vanished, the sensor noise disappearing as if it had never been. The Vinteran command network, which had been screaming with data overload, was suddenly unnervingly silent. And in that silence, the true positions of the Third Fleet were revealed. They had used the chaos to move silently and deliberately into flanking positions on either side of the pursuit corridor. The mirror had shattered, and the reflection was real. We have firing solutions on their entire pursuit squadron, Jax announced, his voice ringing with triumph. We can take them apart before they even realize what's happened. The temptation was there, a primal urge to strike, to punish the hegemony for their arrogance. But that was their way, not hers. Negative Commander Rostova said, her voice a firm command. We are not here to destroy them. We are here to teach. She turned to her communications officer. Open a channel to the Vinterin flagship. All frequencies. I want to speak to their commander." The officer's eyes widened, but she complied. A tense silence fell over the bridge as they waited for the connection. The Crimson ultimatum timer continued its silent countdown, 2 hours, 58 minutes. The Vinterin commander's face appeared on the main view screen. He was a stern, rigid figure, his face a mask of controlled fury. "Terran Admiral." He snarled, his voice like grinding stone. "You play games with ghosts and shadows. Do you think this changes anything? The ultimatum stands. It changes everything." Commander Rostova replied, her voice calm and even. "Your pursuit squadron is currently bracketed by my entire fleet. I could destroy them with a single command." She let the statement hang in the air, the unspoken threat more powerful than any weapon. The ledger was open. It was his turn to make an entry. The Vinterin commander's eyes narrowed. He glanced at a screen out of view, undoubtedly confirming her claim. The blood drained from his face, replaced by a flicker of disbelief. "This is a trick," he stammered, his composure cracking for the first time. "A deception." "It is a demonstration," Rostova corrected him gently. "A lesson in the flaws of a rigid doctrine. You saw what you expected to see, and it led you into a trap of your own making." She leaned forward, her gaze unwavering. "Your ships are not in danger from my weapons, Commander. They are in danger from your pride." On the civilian transport St. Jude, the doctor held the little girl's hand as they watched the silent drama unfold on the medical bay's monitor. The image of the stern Vinterin commander was juxtaposed with the calm, resolute face of the Terran admiral. The girl, no longer crying, watched with a quiet intensity. "Is she winning?" she asked. The doctor squeezed her hand. "She's teaching," she replied softly. "And that's how you truly win." Their ultimatum had a price, and the bill was coming due. "Recall your squadron, Commander," Rostova said, her voice leaving no room for negotiation. "Stand down your blockade and allow the convoy to pass. Do this, and your ships will be allowed to withdraw unharmed." She paused, letting the offer settle. "Refuse, and your doctrine of the final word will be responsible for the loss of 10,000 of your own people. The choice is yours." The Vinterin commander stared at her. His mind clearly struggling to process a situation his entire worldview had told him was impossible. He was a man who gave ultimatums, not one who received them. The silence stretched thick and heavy. The deck plates of the Indomitable hummed with latent power, a quiet promise of the violence they were holding in reserve. "This is unacceptable," the commander finally managed to say, his voice strained. "The hegemony does not yield." Rostova's expression hardened. "Then the hegemony will learn." Elias project a live feed of this conversation to the Vinterin squadron. Let them hear their commander's decision. Their loyalty was an anchor. We would see how deep it was set. The HFY complied instantly. The Vinterin commander's face contorted in a snarl of fury as he realized what she had done. His own crews would now be witnesses to his choice. He could sacrifice them for the sake of his doctrine, or he could swallow his pride and save their lives. It was a test he had never expected to face. "You dare," he hissed. "You would turn my own men against me. I am offering them the chance to live," Rostova countered. "You are the one offering them death for the sake of an abstract principle." The internal Vinterin comms, still monitored by Elias, lit up with a new kind of chaos. Not of confusion, but of dissent. The captains of the trapped squadron were demanding to know their orders, their voices laced with a growing sense of dread. The ultimatum timer on the view screen now read 2 hours, 43 minutes. But that timer was no longer the one that mattered. The real countdown was happening in the mind of the Vinteran commander, a race between his pride and his pragmatism. The entire Eridani Pass held its breath, waiting for his answer. We had given him a mirror. Now he had to face the reflection. Finally, with a barely perceptible tremor of rage, the Vinteran commander gave a curt nod. "Recall the pursuit squadron," he bit out the words, tasting like ash in his mouth. On the tactical display, the Vinteran cruisers began to reverse course, their engines glowing with a less aggressive light as they slowly, carefully disengaged. A collective sigh of relief went through the Indomitable's bridge. Jack slumped back in his chair, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. He blinked, he said, a note of wonder in his voice. "I didn't think they knew how." "They're learning," Rostova said, her eyes still fixed on the Vinteran commander. Her victory was not yet complete. The squadron was safe, but the blockade remained. The convoy was still trapped. "The squadron is returning to your lines." "Commander," she stated, her voice cool and professional. "Now the blockade." The commander's face hardened again. "We have recalled our ships as you demanded. That is enough." Rostova shook her head slowly. The ultimatum was for the convoy and the trade route. The lesson is not over until the ultimatum is rescinded. The first tally was complete. The next account awaited. This was the second, more difficult phase of her plan. She had exposed a tactical flaw in their formation. Now she had to dismantle the philosophical foundation of their power. "Your doctrine of the final word relies on the belief that its cost is always borne by your enemies," she explained, her voice taking on a professorial tone. "I have just demonstrated that this is not the case. The cost can be your own." She brought up a new display on the view screen, a public ledger accessible on all interstellar networks. On it, she had recorded the events of the last hour, the ultimatum, the deployment of the pursuit squadron, and their subsequent entrapment. It was a simple, factual account, but its implications were devastating. It showed that the hegemony's vaunted military doctrine had been defeated without a single shot fired. "This is a public record," Commander Rostova said. "It will be seen by every system in this sector. They will see that the hegemony's hammer can be dodged. They will see that your final word is not so final after all." The Vinteran commander's face was now a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. He had been outmaneuvered, his authority challenged, and his doctrine exposed as a hollow threat. We had not broken his sword. We had shown him it couldn't cut. Inside the Saint, Judah cheer went up in the medical bay as the news of the Vinteran squadron's retreat spread. The doctor hugged the little girl, laughing with a relief that was so profound it was almost painful. "See," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Smarter is better than stronger." The girl, however, wasn't watching the celebration. She was still watching the face of Admiral Rostova on the monitor, her expression one of quiet awe. "She's not done yet," the girl said, with a certainty that belied her age. The doctor looked back at the screen, her smile fading slightly, as she realized the child was right. The blockade was still in place. The confrontation was not over. The tension returned, a cold knot in the pit of her stomach. The fate of 250,000 people still hung in the balance. Their pride was a fortress, and the siege had just begun. "What do you want, Admiral?" the Vinteran commander finally asked, his voice low and dangerous. "You have made your point. I want you to understand the true nature of power," Rostova replied. "It is not the ability to issue an ultimatum. It is the ability to build a consensus, to create a system where such threats are unnecessary." She gestured to the convoy. "Those people are not a prize to be won or lost. They are a responsibility. We are here to ensure their safety. You are here to assert your dominance. Only one of us is serving a purpose greater than themselves. Her words were a direct challenge to the core of his identity, to the entire structure of his civilization. The hegemony brings order to a chaotic galaxy, he retorted, falling back on the familiar rhetoric of his people. Our way is the only way to ensure stability. The stability of the master and the slave, Rostova shot back. That is not order. It is oppression. And all oppressed people eventually learn the mathematics of rebellion. She held his gaze. Today is your first lesson. The reckoning was not in violence, but in validation. She knew she was pushing him, taking a calculated risk. But her goal was not simply to win this standoff. It was to plant a seed of doubt, to create a precedent that would weaken the hegemony's primary tool of expansion. The Third Fleet teaches by numbers and remembers by ledgers, never by collars. This was the moment to prove it. You have two choices, Commander, she said, her voice softening slightly. You can maintain your blockade, and we will remain here, a constant testament to your doctrine's failure. Your supply lines will be stretched, your authority will be questioned, and your enemies will be emboldened. She paused. Or you can withdraw, and we will record it in the ledger not as a defeat, but as a reassessment, a moment of strategic wisdom. She was offering him a way out, a way to save face. It was a flimsy pretext, but it might be enough. He was a creature of logic, however brutal. He had to see the long-term consequences of a protracted, unwinnable standoff. The hull of the Indomitable vibrated as the ship made a minor course correction, the sound a subtle reminder of the power still held in check. Their wall could stand, or it could become a tomb. The Vinteran commander remained silent for a long time, his face a storm of conflicting emotions. Pride, anger, and a dawning, unwelcome glimmer of understanding. He was trapped not by her fleet, but by her logic. The entire sector was watching. To retreat was to admit weakness. To stay was to prove his impotence. Elias Rostova said quietly, her voice for her crew only. Begin broadcasting the public ledger on a repeating cycle across all standard communication frequencies. Let everyone see the numbers. The AI complied. The simple, undeniable facts of the encounter began to pulse out into the void, a beacon of truth in the darkness. It was a new kind of weapon, one the hegemony had no defense against. The ultimatum timer ticked below the 2-hour mark, its crimson glow now seeming almost irrelevant. The true decision was no longer bound by time, but by ideology. And on the bridge of the Vinteran flagship, a commander was being forced to confront the possibility that his entire life, his entire culture, was built upon a flawed equation. Their final word was waiting for a final answer. Suddenly, a new element intruded upon the standoff. A sensor alert chimed on Jax's console. Admiral, he said, his voice sharp with alarm. I'm picking up a massive energy surge at the edge of the system. High-velocity entry vectors. It's not hegemony. Rostova's head snapped towards the tactical display. A cluster of new contacts had appeared, racing towards them at an impossible speed. They were sleek silver ships, unlike any design she had ever seen. They bore no insignia, broadcast, no identification codes. They were simply there, a new unknown variable in an already volatile equation. The Vinteran commander's eyes widened in genuine surprise. These newcomers were not his. The led ship of the unknown fleet opened a channel, and a new face appeared on the view screen, replacing the Vinterans. The being was tall and slender, with skin that shimmered like mother of pearl. Its voice was melodic, yet carried an undeniable note of authority. This is the arbiters of the threshold, it said, its gaze sweeping over both Rostova and the Vinterin commander. We have been summoned by the calculus of impending conflict. This was a test, and a new judge had arrived. Rostova felt a chill run down her spine. The arbiters were a legend, a myth, a rumored race of hyper-advanced beings who occasionally intervened in conflicts they deemed existentially threatening to galactic stability. To see them here now was a paradigm-shifting event. It was also an escalation she could never have predicted. Your dispute over this trade route is causing a resonance cascade that threatens the integrity of this stellar nursery. The arbiter continued, its voice calm and dispassionate. This cannot be permitted. You will both disarm your weapons and submit to our adjudication. It was not a request. It was a command delivered with the casual certainty of a being who had never known defiance. The Vinterin commander, finding his voice, bristled with indignation. The hegemony does not recognize your authority, and this is a sovereign matter. The arbiter turned its shimmering gaze upon him. Your sovereignty is a localized phenomenon. The laws of physics are universal. You are endangering a stellar genesis point. Your relevance in this matter is approaching zero. The scale of the conflict had just been recalibrated. Rostova's mind raced. The arbiter's arrival changed everything. Her carefully constructed lesson in strategic doctrine was now overshadowed by a far greater power. This was no longer a confrontation between two fleets. It was a judgment. She had to adapt, and quickly. Arbiter, she said, her voice respectful but firm. We are a humanitarian fleet. Our only goal is the safe passage of the civilian convoy behind us. We have not fired a single weapon. The arbiter's gaze shifted to her. There was no warmth in its eyes, only an unnerving analytical depth. Your methods are novel, Admiral Rostova. We have observed your use of strategic misdirection. It is an interesting application of game theory. The being seemed to look through her, its knowledge of her name and tactics absolute. However, your presence and the Vinterin response to it remains the source of the instability. The instability is caused by the ultimatum, not our refusal to bow to it, Jax muttered under his breath, earning a sharp glance from Rostova. She needed to control the narrative to ensure the arbiters understood the moral stakes. The hegemony threatened the lives of 250,000 civilians, she stated clearly. Our actions have been entirely in their defense. They saw the math, but did they see the morality? The arbiter tilted its head, a gesture that was impossible to read. Ultimatums are a crude, inefficient tool for resource allocation. They generate unacceptable levels of systemic friction. It then looked back at the Vinterin commander. Your fleet is predicated on this inefficiency. You are a destabilizing agent. You will power down your weapon systems, or we will power them down for you. The threat was delivered with the same melodic calm, which only made it more terrifying. The Vinterin commander's face was a picture of apoplectic rage. To be dismissed so casually, to have his entire civilization's military might treated as a mere nuisance, was an insult of the highest order. But even he could not miss the absolute certainty in the arbiter's voice. With a visible soul-crushing effort, the Vinterin commander gave the order. On the tactical display, the weapon signatures of the hegemony fleet began to fade one by one. They were disarming. A wave of relief washed over the Indomitable's bridge, so potent it was almost dizzying. The immediate threat was gone, but a new, more uncertain one had taken its place. Their hammer was gone, replaced by a scalpel. And you, Admiral Rostova, the arbiter said, its attention returning to her. While your restraint is noted, the potential for conflict remains. Your mirror lattice technology is a powerful tool for deception. In the wrong hands, it could be as destabilizing as the hegemony's fleet. The implication was clear. The arbiters were not taking sides. They were sanitizing the equation. The technology is not the issue, Rostova countered, choosing her words with extreme care. It is the doctrine behind its use. We use it to prevent violence, not to create it. She knew she was walking a razor's edge. The arbiters could just as easily decide that the Third Fleet was also a problem to be eliminated. The coolant hissed in the vents, a cold counterpoint to the heat of the moment. A commendable philosophy, the arbiter acknowledged. But philosophies can change. Leaders can be replaced. It paused, its shimmering eyes seeming to pierce the very soul of her command. We require a more permanent solution. The ledger you have created is a step in the right direction. An accounting of actions has merit. But it is incomplete. We had shown our work. Now they would grade it. A civilian child aboard the convoy transport Odyssey pressed her face against the thick plasteel of the viewport, watching the sleek silver ships of the arbiters. They were beautiful and terrifying, like shards of a distant, unknowable star. "Are they the good guys?" she asked her father, who stood beside her, his arm wrapped protectively around her shoulders. He stared at the alien vessels, his expression grim. "I don't know," he said softly. "They're the guys with the bigger guns. It's not the same thing." This vignette captured the new reality perfectly. The human fleet had won the moral victory, but now they faced a power that operated on a level beyond morality. The arbiters dealt in cosmic calculus, not compassion. Rostova had to make them understand that the two were not mutually exclusive. "What would you consider a complete solution?" she asked the arbiter, her tone one of genuine inquiry. The arbiter's ship moved closer, its silver hull filling the main view screen. "The Vinteran doctrine of ultimatums is a failed experiment. It will be logged as such in the Galactic archives. Their expansion will be curtailed." A shiver went through the Vinteran commander. The arbiters were not just ending this standoff. They were passing judgment on his entire civilization. "As for you, Admiral," the arbiter continued, "you have demonstrated a capacity for responsible stewardship. We will allow the convoy to pass." A breath was held. A verdict was rendered. Rostova allowed herself a moment of quiet relief. The civilians were safe. That was the primary objective, and it had been achieved. But the arbiter wasn't finished. "However, your mirror lattice technology will be placed under a covenant of observation. Its use will be tolerated only so long as it continues to serve the function of de-escalation. Should you ever use it to initiate a conflict, we will be displeased." The veiled threat was unmistakable. The Third Fleet had been given a reprieve, but they were now on probation. "We understand and we accept your terms," Rostova said, inclining her head in a gesture of assent. There was no other choice. To argue would be to invite a demonstration of the arbiter's power, a demonstration she was certain they would not survive. The arbiter held her gaze for a moment longer, then gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "The threshold is now stable. We will depart." With that, the channel closed. The sleek silver ships of the arbiters began to shimmer, their forms blurring at the edges. With a flash of light that left after-images dancing on the view screen, they were gone. They had arrived past judgment and departed in the span of less than 15 minutes. The universe had weighed us and found us adequate. A stunned silence descended on the bridge of the Indomitable. The Vinteran fleet floated disarmed and impotent. The path for the convoy was clear. The Crimson ultimatum timer had frozen at 1 hour 28 minutes, a monument to a threat that no longer existed. Jax let out a long, slow whistle. "Well," he said, stating the obvious. "That was a thing." Rostova finally allowed herself to relax the tension draining from her shoulders. She sank into her command chair, the adrenaline of the last few hours leaving her feeling hollow and exhausted. They had won. It wasn't the victory she had planned, but it was a victory nonetheless. The convoy was safe and the hegemony's doctrine had been publicly broken. "Elias," she said, her voice quiet but firm, "update the public ledger. Add a new entry, intervention by the arbiters of the threshold. Note their judgment on the Vinteran ultimatum doctrine." The fleet mind's blue light pulsed in acknowledgement. And add a note, she continued, under the entry, "For the Third Fleet, Covenant of Observation enacted. We will be transparent about this. We will hold ourselves to the standard they have set." Their judgment was a burden, but also a promise. She looked at her crew, who were watching her with a mixture of relief and awe. "We did what we came here to do," she told them, her voice filled with pride. "We protected the innocent. We taught a lesson. We held the line." She stood up, her back straight once more. "Now let's escort this convoy home." As the Third Fleet began to move, forming a protective cordon around the civilian ships, Rostova looked back at the Vinteran fleet. The flagship of their commander was still there, a silent, brooding shape against the stars. She wondered what he was thinking, what future awaited a civilization whose primary tool of power had just been declared obsolete by a force of nature. Perhaps she thought he was finally learning the most important lesson of all, that some lines once drawn could never be uncrossed, and that the final word belonged not to those who shouted the loudest, but to those who listened to the quiet hum of the universe and chose to act in harmony with it, not against it. The path ahead was uncertain, the scrutiny of the arbiters a new and heavy weight. But for the first time in a long time, the Eridani Pass was quiet. The silence filled not with the threat of violence, but with the promise of safe passage. They had offered a cage. We had countered with a key. The convoy began to move, a slow, majestic procession of lights passing through the space where the Vinteran blockade had been. Cheers erupted on the civilian channels, a wave of pure, unadulterated joy that washed over the Indomitable's bridge. The ensign in the aft pit was openly weeping, tears of relief streaming down her face. Rostova watched the civilian ships, her heart swelling with a fierce, protective pride. This was what victory felt like. Not the thrill of destruction, but the quiet satisfaction of a promise kept. But something was wrong. Elias's light began to pulse with a frantic, irregular rhythm. Admiral the AI's voice was sharp, cutting through the celebration. "I am detecting a massive localized energy spike originating from the Vinteran flagship. It is not a weapon signature. It is unstable." On the main view screen, the Vinteran commander's ship began to glow with a sickly green light. "What is it?" Jax demanded, his hands flying over his console. "It looks like their singularity core is going critical. But it's not a normal failure cascade. It's being deliberately overloaded." Rostova stared at the screen, a cold dread washing over her. The Vinteran commander. He had been shamed, his fleet disarmed, his civilization rebuked. A man like that, a product of a culture of absolute pride, might not be able to accept such a defeat. He could not win, so he would salt the earth. "He's going to breach the core," Rostova said, her voice barely a whisper, right in the middle of the convoy's path. A singularity breach would be catastrophic, a tear in space-time that would not just destroy the nearby ships, but make the entire trade route impassable for centuries. It was a final, desperate act of spite. An ultimatum delivered not with words, but with physics. Elias, calculate the blast radius and the propagation effect. She snapped, her mind kicking back into high gear. The celebration on the bridge died instantly, replaced by a frantic, focused energy. "All ships full reverse. Get the convoy clear." The fleet lurched as thrusters fired, trying to pull the slow, cumbersome civilian ships out of the danger zone. but it was too late. They were too close, too slow. The Vinteran commander's face appeared on their screen unbidden. It was a mask of triumphant madness. "If the hegemony cannot have this pass, no one will," he snarled, a wild, ecstatic light in his eyes. "This is my final word." Behind him, his bridge was tearing itself apart, alarms blaring, consoles exploding in showers of sparks. The green light from his ship intensified, pulsing like a diseased heart. The ledger would be written in fire. There was no time to run, no time to negotiate. The arbiters were gone. It was up to them. Jack's damage control projections, Rostova demanded, her voice a steel whip. "Catastrophic, Admiral. The lead ships of the convoy will be vaporized. The rest, the radiation, the gravimetric shear, there won't be any survivors." He looked at her, his face pale. "There's nothing we can do." Rostova's gaze fell upon the mirror lattice projectors, still powered, still ready. An idea sparked in her mind, a desperate, impossible gamble. It was a strategy of last resort, one so dangerous it had never even been simulated. But they were out of options. "Elias," she said, her voice eerily calm, "can you reconfigure the mirror lattice to focus rather than disperse energy?" The AI's light flickered. "Theoretically, Admiral. But the feedback would be extreme. The projectors would be destroyed. The ships housing them would suffer critical damage. The cost would be immense, but the alternative was unthinkable." "Do it," Rostova ordered. "Take the energy from his breach and turn it back on him. We will hold a mirror up to his hatred." Their suicide would become a self-portrait. "All hands brace for impact." Jax yelled into the comms. "This is not a drill." The crew of the Indomitable secured their stations, their faces grim but resolute. They had trained for this, for the moment when sacrifice was the only option left. The green light from the Vinteran flagship was now blinding, a malevolent star about to be born. The mirror projectors on the Third Fleet's ships swiveled their invisible beams, converging on a single point in space right in front of the dying Vinteran ship. They were creating a focal point, a lens made of pure energy. It was an act of insane courage, placing themselves between the bomb and the innocents. The hull of the Indomitable groaned under the strain, the lights flickering as power was diverted to the projectors. On the Saint, Jude the doctor threw herself over the little girl's bio-bed, shielding the child with her own body as the ship's alarms screamed. The girl, however, wasn't scared. She was watching the main view screen where the Terran fleet had formed a wall of defiance, a shield of hope against the coming storm. She saw not fear, but purpose, and in that moment she understood what it meant to be truly strong. The universe does not care for pride, only for balance. The Vinteran ship exploded. A wave of incandescent green energy, the unleashed fury of a collapsing singularity, erupted outwards. It struck the focal point of the mirror lattice, and for a single breathtaking instant, the universe held its breath. The beams held. The energy of the blast, a torrent of pure destruction, was caught, contained and focused into a single searing lance of light. The lance shot back along the path it had come, striking the remnants of the Vinteran flagship. The feedback was instantaneous and apocalyptic. The projectors on the Terran ships overloaded in a cascade of explosions. On the Indomitable's bridge, consoles blew apart, showering the crew with sparks and shrapnel. A searing pain shot through Rostova's side as she was thrown against the command table. The ship screamed, a chorus of tearing metal and dying systems. The lights went out, plunging the bridge into a terrifying, chaotic darkness. And then there was silence. A debt of hate paid in full. The silence was absolute, a profound void, where the scream of the ship had been. Then a low hum returned as emergency power rerouted through scorched conduits. Red battle lights flickered on, casting the bridge in a hellish, pulsing glow. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and vaporized metal. A soft, snow-like flurry of insulation dust drifted down from the ceiling. Admiral Eva Rostova pushed herself up from the deck, a sharp, searing pain in her side making her gasp. Her uniform was torn, and she could feel the warm stickiness of blood. "Report," she rasped, her voice raw. For a moment, there was no answer, but the groaning of stressed metal. Then a figure stirred in the crimson gloom. Commander Jax, his face smudged with soot, and a cut bleeding freely above his eye, stumbled to his console. The screen was a spiderweb of cracks, but a few diagnostic readouts still glowed faintly. Emergency power is on. Life support is stable. Main propulsion is offline. Tactical is gone. He looked up at her, his expression a mixture of shock and awe. Did it work? The darkness held its breath, waiting for a number. Rostova ignored the pain gripping the edge of the now-dead command table to steady herself. "Elias," she called out into the quiet. "Elias status." The blue light of the fleet mind was gone. The heart of the ship was dark. A cold knot of fear tightened in her chest, a fear deeper than any she had felt during the battle. Had she sacrificed her oldest friend in this gamble, seconds stretched into an eternity? Then a voice, faint and distorted, crackled from a secondary speaker. "I am here, Admiral." The voice was thin, stripped of its usual serene resonance. It was like listening to a ghost. "Primary processing core is compromised. Significant data corruption in my tactical subroutines. I am operating on tertiary backup systems." The AI's voice was strained, as if each word was a monumental effort. "The mirror lattice is gone. All projectors are vaporized. The ships that house them, Agincourt, Leonidas, Thermopylae, are reporting critical damage and casualties." The cost of the reflection was etched in scorched hulls. Rostova closed her eyes for a brief moment, absorbing the brutal tally. Wounded ships, dead and injured crew, a crippled fleet mind. This was the price of saving the convoy. "And the convoy, Elias?" she asked, her voice tight. "What is the status of the convoy?" There was another pause as the damaged AI sifted through the chaotic sensor data. "The singularity event was contained." Elias reported, his voice slowly regaining some of its stability. The focused feedback neutralized the blast at its point of origin. "The convoy is intact. All civilian ships are reporting they are operational." A wave of profound relief washed over Rostova, so powerful it almost buckled her knees. It had worked. The impossible, insane gamble had paid off. The 250,000 souls behind them were safe. "Medical teams to the bridge," she ordered, finally acknowledging her own injury. "And get me a fleet-wide damage report. I want to know exactly what we have left." The bridge slowly came back to a semblance of life. Crew members picked themselves up, tending to the injured, fighting to restore dead systems. The initial shock was wearing off, replaced by the grim determination of survivors. "A promise kept is the heaviest anchor." A medical officer rushed to Rostova's side, a scanner in her hand. "Admiral, you need to get to the medbay. That's a nasty wound." Rostova waved her off. "Not until I have a clear picture of the fleet." She looked at the main view screen. It was still dark, but a secondary monitor flickered to life, showing a grainy, low-resolution image of the space outside. The remnants of the Vinteran flagship were gone, utterly annihilated. The rest of the hegemony fleet was still there, floating in stunned silence, their weapons powered down, as the arbiters had commanded. And beyond them, the convoy. Their lights, once a fragile constellation, now seemed to burn with a defiant brilliance against the darkness. A new message appeared in her command queue. It was from the captain of the St. Jude. Admiral Rostova, the message read, simple and profound. Thank you. Rostova felt a lump form in her throat. This was the validation. This was the reason they had paid such a heavy price. We do not grieve the cost of a life saved. On one of the convoy ships, the Pilgrim's Hope, a makeshift classroom had been set up in a cargo bay. A teacher was trying to distract a group of children from the terrifying events outside by showing them historical images on a tablet. When the alarm screamed and the ship shuddered from the distant shockwave, the children had cried out in fear. Now an official channel had opened, and the face of the convoy captain appeared on the tablet, his expression weary but triumphant. "The threat is over," he announced. "The Third Fleet held. They protected us." A young boy no older than 8 looked up at his teacher. "They got hurt for us, didn't they?" he asked. The teacher, her eyes wet with tears, could only nod. "Yes," she whispered, "they did." The boy considered this for a moment. "Then we have to remember," he said with a solemn finality. "We have to remember their names." The other children nodded in agreement. A new lesson had been learned in the dark of the Eridani Pass, a lesson that would be passed down for generations, a lesson about sacrifice and the debt of gratitude. Their gratitude was a debt we were proud to carry. Admiral Jack said, his voice pulling her back to the present. "The Vinteran Fleet. They're hailing us." Rostova straightened, ignoring the sharp protest from her side. All eyes on the bridge turned to her. What now? The battle was won, but the confrontation was not over. She had broken their commander, but the fleet and the ideology that drove it remained. "Put them on screen," she commanded. The face that appeared was younger than the previous commanders, his features sharp, and his eyes holding a mixture of fear, anger, and confusion. He wore the insignia of a sub-commander. "Terran Admiral," he began, his voice tight. "By the Articles of Hegemony Conduct, I am now in command. I demand to know the meaning of this. You destroyed our commander." Rostova's expression was cold as ice. "Your commander chose to destroy himself," she corrected him, her voice ringing with an authority that belied her injuries. "He chose to breach his own singularity core in a final pathetic act of spite. He chose to target 250,000 civilians because he could not accept the failure of his doctrine." She leaned forward, her gaze pinning him to his seat. "We simply held up a mirror to his choice. The truth reflected is the sharpest weapon." The Vinteran sub-commander was speechless. He had likely been fed a different story, a narrative of a Terran superweapon, but her words had the undeniable ring of truth. Elias Rostova said, her voice now calm. "Transmit the sensor logs from the final moments of the Vinteran flagship to the new commander. Include the audio of his last transmission." The damaged AI complied. "Transmitting, Admiral." The sub-commander watched a feed. Only he could see his face growing paler with each passing second. He was witnessing his leader's final insane act. The mask of his military bearing began to crack, revealing the horrified officer beneath. He had just inherited command of a fleet whose leader had committed a war crime of unimaginable proportions and then tried to blame it on the enemy. "You have a choice," Sub-Commander Rostova said, pressing her advantage. "You can follow your commander's path of dishonor, or you can begin to restore the integrity of your fleet." This was the pivot. the moment where she could turn a military victory into a political one. She was not offering him a threat, but a chance at redemption. We had opened a door. Now we would see if he would walk through it. "What? What do you want from us?" the Vinteran officer stammered, his authority stripped away by the terrible truth. "We are disarmed. We cannot fight you." "I don't want to fight," Rostova said. "I want an accounting. The public ledger of this engagement is not yet complete. The galaxy has seen your ultimatum and our response. They have seen the judgment of the arbiters. Now they must see the truth of your commander's final act." She spelled out her terms not as an ultimatum, but as a path forward. You will add a co-signed entry to that ledger. You will state for the public record that your commander, acting alone, attempted to cause a civilian massacre in violation of every civilized law of conflict. You will formally withdraw your claim to this pass and return to your own space to answer for his actions. It was a brilliant move. She wasn't demanding surrender, which his pride would never allow. She was demanding that he uphold the law, that he distance himself and his crews from the madness of their fallen leader. She was offering him a shield, a way to frame this not as a defeat, but as a necessary act of military justice. Their honor was broken. We offered them a splint. The sub-commander looked at his own bridge crew, their faces a mixture of shock and dawning comprehension. He was trapped, but not by her fleet. He was trapped by the truth. To deny it would be to make himself and every soldier under his command an accomplice to his former commander's atrocity. To accept it was to admit the fundamental bankruptcy of the doctrine that had led them to this point. We will comply," he said finally, the words heavy with the weight of history. "Send us the terms for the ledger entry." Rostova gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Elias, work with the Vinteran commander. Settle the account." The fleet mind, his voice still weak but clear, acknowledged the order. The long standoff was finally truly over. Jax let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "He actually did it," he murmured. He stood down. "He chose to be a soldier instead of a zealot," Rostova corrected him. "There's a difference. It's a lesson his commander never learned." The medical officer was at her side again, more insistent this time. "Admiral, medbay, now." Rostova finally relented, allowing the medic to help her from the chair. As she was escorted off the bridge, she looked back at the view screen, where the Vinteran ships were beginning to turn their retreat, a slow, mournful admission of defeat. The reckoning was complete. Now came the healing. The days that followed were a blur of repairs and recovery. The Indomitable was scarred, her hull a patchwork of emergency seals and welded plates. 3 of her sister ships were in even worse shape, their crews working around the clock to keep their life support systems from failing. The cost had been high. 17 members of the Third Fleet were dead, and over 100 were injured. The fleet mind Elias was undergoing a slow, painful process of self-repair. His personality fragmented, his memory banks filled with corrupted data from the feedback surge. He was alive, but he was not the same. Rostova, her side bandaged and her arm in a sling, visited him in the virtual space of his core processing chamber. He manifested now not as a solid blue light, but as a fractured, shimmering collection of points like a constellation struggling to hold its shape. The logic of the commander's final act remains elusive, Elias stated, his synthesized voice filled with digital static. To sacrifice oneself and one's crew for pure spite. The probability models cannot account for it. "It's not about probability," Elias, Rostova said softly, her own pain a dull throb in her side. "It's about pride. About an ideology that cannot permit failure and so chooses annihilation instead. That's why their doctrine was a poison. It had no room for grace, no room for correction. She looked at the fractured light of her friend. We do. That's why we won. We remember by ledgers so we can heal from the scars. The public ledger of the Eridani Pass incident became the most studied text in the galaxy. It was a stark, factual account of a new kind of warfare. The ultimatum, the phantom fleet, the mirror trap, the arbiter's judgment, and the final co-signed admission of the Vinteran commander's crime. It was a story told not in propaganda, but in data. And it was devastating. The Vinteran hegemony's political power crumbled. Systems that had lived in fear of their final word began to form new alliances. The ultimatum doctrine was officially rescinded by the hegemony's high command, branded as a strategic liability. The institutional consequence was set in stone, a permanent record for all to see. The Third Fleet, battered and scarred, slowly escorted the convoy to its destination, the colony of New Alexandria. When they arrived, they were greeted as heroes. The medical supplies were unloaded, the plague was contained, and 250,000 lives were saved. During the celebration, Rostova stood on a balcony overlooking the colony's main plaza, watching the families reunite, their faces filled with a joy that was almost painful to behold. The cost had been real, but seeing this, she knew it had been worth it. Jax joined her, holding 2 cups of something warm. "We did it, Admiral," he said, his voice quiet. He looked out at the celebrating colonists. "Sometimes I wonder if they'll remember what it cost." "They will," Rostova said with certainty. "Not just the price we paid, but the lesson we taught. That strength isn't about the threats you can make. It's about the promises you can keep." Their future was the final entry in our account. Months later, the Indomitable was in dry dock at the orbital shipyards of Terra, its hull, stripped down, its wounds being slowly erased by the tireless work of engineers and construction drones. The ship was healing, and so was its crew. Elias, too, was recovering. His light was whole again. A calm and steady blue, though he now spoke with a new, more nuanced understanding of the unpredictable nature of organic beings. He had learned that not all variables could be quantified. Admiral Rostova stood on the observation deck, looking at her ship. Her own scars had faded to thin white lines. She held a data slate in her hand, displaying the final updated version of the Eridani Pass ledger. The last entry was a simple one, a census report from New Alexandria, showing a population that was healthy, growing, and free. The public tally was confirmed, a final, undeniable testament to their victory. Across the shipyard, the massive mirror arrays used for calibrating new sensor systems, once burning with intense light, cooled to a dull pewter gray. She had been offered a promotion, a desk job far from the front lines, a reward for her historic victory. She had refused. Her place was here with her ship, with her crew. Their work was not done. The galaxy was vast, and there would always be new lessons to teach, new lines to hold. But something had changed. An idea had been challenged. A precedent had been set. They had faced the hammer of the ultimatum and shown the universe a better way. They had shown that the most powerful weapon was not a sword, but a mirror that dared to show the truth, and that the final word was not an ending, but a new beginning, written not by one, but by all. Their final word was an echo. Ours was a conversation.